Hi. Today we're going to be talking about death and more specifically how death can be a positive guiding force in our life that I feel as though isn't really spoken about enough, especially in the West, where we are probably the most death denying culture on earth. A lot of people in Australia and the United States have never seen a dead person before. And if they do see a dead person, it's often dressed up in Maybelline and formaldehyde. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about my philosophy towards death and more specifically how I believe death can enrich our experience of life as well as be a positive guiding force in so many different ways. I want to start off with an anecdote. So 2 years ago, I got memento mori tattooed on my hands. And memento mori is Latin for remember you must die. And whenever I tell people the translation, there's usually like a recoil. And people are like, oh. And I think people tend to have that reaction that I have something that they perceive as quite macabre tattooed on a body part that I literally see thousands of times per day. And I feel as though this reaction is very typical of Western culture, which sees death and talking about death as taboo. We don't like to think about death. We don't like to discuss death. And we don't like to acknowledge it as an inevitable reality of life. When death is often associated with violence, and that's the typical representation of death that we see in the West. It's often associated with violent scenes or car crashes. It's always depicted in a violent way, usually in films and TV series and in the news. So there's no wonder why death has become a frowned upon topic in the West. One of my favorite books of all time is All About Love by Bell Hooks. If you have not read it, I sincerely implore you to go read that book. I feel like it was incredibly transformative for me in terms of my worldview and just articulating so many truths that I didn't have the words for. And Bell Hooks writes that despite the worship of death we see in our television screens, which partially satisfies our human curiosity about death, it counterintuitively does not prepare us in any way to be able to face dying with awareness, clarity, or peace of mind. And this sentiment is echoed by Dr. Sheldon Solomon, who is a social psychologist at Skidmore College, who has spent over 40 years researching the effects of death anxiety on human behavior. He argues that Western culture is one of the most blatantly death-denying culture perhaps in the history of Earth. When you think about it as well, like the West and the way that we treat dying and death, like we ship away our elderly to nursing homes and delegate death to hospices and funeral parlors, and we dress corpses in formaldehyde and Maybelline and keep the topic of death at a comfortable distance, refusing to acknowledge its inevitability. When our cultural denial of death is rooted in fear, it doesn't allow us to live fully or well. While death anxiety can inspire terror in us, it can also enrich our experience of life. This is a core principle of the emerging death positive movement, which aims to get people talking about death honestly, compassionately, and openly. Our reluctance to talk about the D word and keep it at a distance has unintentionally ostracized those who are dying and their loved ones who remain. If we can't discuss death, then we also can't discuss how to better the lives of those affected by it. Spoiler alert, no one gets out of this thing alive, babe. We're all affected by death. Instead of turning away from this reality and repressing whatever anxiety this arises in us, I think we'd do better to confront these fears and show how they manifest head on. One way the death positive movement aims to do this is through a concept called death cafes, which is a social franchise developed by John Underwood in London in 2011, where strangers gather to eat cake, drink tea, and discuss death. Teehee. It sounds like kind of morbid in a way, doesn't it? The aim is to increase awareness of death with a view to helping people make the most of their finite lives. Instead of denying death, which is always among us, we can instead let this awareness guide us, helping us live each day as though it is our last. As an aside, it just reminds me of the Barbie scene where Barbie's like, do you guys ever think about dying? Because that is me all the time. Like, truth be told, I feel like one of the big shaping forces of my life and partially why I have memento mori tattooed on my hands is at a very young age, I lost a lot of people. When I was around 14 or so, I went to 3 funerals in 2 days. I just had the biggest existential crisis known to man. It was my first proper time coming to grips with that reality of the fact that I will pass and everyone that I love will pass. Dude, I spiraled. I went straight down into nihilism, bro. Nihilism grabbed me by the fucking jugular and said, come here, bitch. I also distinctly remember how ostracized I felt at the time, especially among my peers who were similar age. Like one of my best friends who I love and cherish. She's basically a sister to me. We basically had this conversation, I think, when I was 14 or 15. And I was like to her, like, do you think about death a lot? She was like, nope. Hadn't even occurred to her, which I'm not shaming her at all. I feel like it's quite a good thing at that age to not be haunted by those feelings of death and reconciling death intellectually. But she was just like, no, what the fuck? She's like, nope. I was like, damn. And it just made me feel very isolated. But regardless, back to the point at hand. A recent study by researchers at Georgetown University illustrate that the more mindful and aware we are of our own death, the less fear and anxiety the prospect of death will give us. Mindfulness towards death is a skill that can be cultivated at any age or any stage of health. It isn't something solely for the aging or those who are experiencing poor health at the moment. This awareness of death can guide us in positive ways, both as a decision-making tool and through self-actualization and through love. Death as a decision-making tool has helped me in innumerable ways. Whenever I have felt as though I am at a crossroads in life, I always try and take the perspective of the grave. And what I mean by that, I think about on my deathbed, will I regret not doing a certain action more than the fear and the risk and the apprehension that comes with it? I'm reminded of Steve Jobs' 2005 commencement speech where he says, remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big decisions in life. Because almost everything, all external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment or failure, these things fall away in the face of death, leaving only what is truly important. Remembering that you are going to die is the best way I know to avoid the trap of thinking you have something to lose. Love that. You are already naked. There is no reason not to follow your heart. No one wants to die. Even people who want to go to heaven don't want to die to get there. And yet, death is the destination we all share. No one has ever escaped it, and that's how it should be, because death is very likely the single best invention of life. It's life's change agent. It clears out the old to make way for the new. And you know what's so interesting, right? This reminds me of a book that I've read recently called Homo Deus by Yuval Noah Harari. And what was very interesting in that book to me, I highly recommend it. It was one of the best books that I read last year. One of the things that he talks about is the advent of technology and how we've basically got a lot of Silicon Valley tech execs who, like Brian Johnson, even Ray Kurzweil, they've all been involved in like little mini startups, which are essentially trying to fight the inevitability of death. And he kind of talks about if technology is advancing at an almost exponential rate, especially compounded with the factors of AI, you've got genetic engineering, you've got brain-computer interfaces like Neuralink, which is being developed by Elon Musk. You've got all these advances in medicine, in mRNA vaccine, and if we manage to achieve immortality or something close to immortality, how will that affect our societies? And it's just so interesting because harkens back to Steve Jobs' point about death being life's change agent and that it's a way for the old to clear to make way for the new. And I think it's really important that we have death as part of our societies because it helps remove stagnancy, particularly in our institutions. Like look at the Supreme Court, for example. Those people have reached the absolute height of their careers in the United States, and the only way that fresh judges can enter the top of the Supreme Court is if one of those fuckers dies. Imagine if we managed to increase our human lifespan to like 300 years. And then you got those fuckers on the Supreme Court who are just like presiding over that until they die. Like, what kind of flow-on effects will that have? Same with politics. That was just like interesting thought experiment and something that Brian Johnson himself should consider. But coming back to the point at hand, I feel as though mindfulness of death can help us distinguish between what we feel we should want and what we truly want. And I feel as though knowing that tomorrow isn't promised also spurs us into action and emboldens us to live the fullest expression of ourselves. Coming back to death as a decision-making tool, for me personally, like when it came to the decision of making this podcast, for example, I have a lot of fear and apprehension about putting myself out there and revealing myself intellectually. I guess what helps me spur myself into action is the fact that I would much rather deal with the fear of putting myself out there and getting flack for it or whatever versus the fear of not realizing my potential and the fear of leaving shit on the table when I'm on my deathbed. Because we always think that we have tomorrow, but the reality is that we don't. Like, the only thing that we truly have in this moment is the breath in our lungs. I think this also really helps me in terms of speaking what's truly on my heart. And whenever I say goodbye to someone, I always try and treat that experience as though I will never see that person again. And so that's why I always use any opportunity I can to express what's on my heart and how I feel about someone and just express my love for them. Because it's like, you got to give people their flowers while they're still alive, right? Any opportunity I can to become a fucking simp, I will take it. I will take it and grab that opportunity with both hands, okay? Christmas Day, I was sending around these fucking love letters to all my friends being like, I fucking love you. And this is why. I always got to say what's on my heart. And similarly, in terms of romantic situations as well, I always try and just express how I feel from the jump and just be open and honest. Like, life is way too short to be playing games, bro. Death can help us both as a decision-making tool and also as a way to become more fully self-actualized. In Intimate Death, Marie de Hennezel describes witnessing the way approaching death can allow people to become more fully self-actualized. She writes, at the moment of utter solitude, when the body breaks down on the edge of infinity, a separate time begins to run that cannot be measured in any normal way. In the course of several days, something happens with the help of another presence that allows despair and pain to declare themselves. The dying seize hold of their lives, take possession of them, and unlock their truth. They discover the freedom of being true to themselves. And I feel as though we would be lucky if we felt the power of death in all of our days and not just when our days are ending. We can face our fear of death with more courage. And I feel as though we gain this courage through love. These words from bell hooks are like my personal hymn. They are absolute gospel to me. And those words are, love is the only force that allows us to hold one another close beyond the grave. That is why knowing how to love each other is also a way of knowing how to die. These words have been torch bearers for me during dark times when I have felt scared to share what's truly on my heart. Honesty and vulnerability are the bedrock of love, and understanding that tomorrow isn't promised and that we may not see the other person again can help us speak our truths. It is a way for us to embody a love ethic and live more consciously. Life is meaningless, but I'm an absurdist, and I believe that it's up to us to find our own meaning, our own immortality project, as Dr. Solomon describes, something that can outlive us, our own set of principles that can help us confront and manage this fear of self-annihilation. I cannot prescribe that to you, but I can describe the ways in which the awareness of death can serve us as the faithful reminder that the time to do what we feel called to do is always now and not in some imagined and non-existent future. Even if what you feel called to do is getting a silly little death reminder tattooed on your hands. So if you've listened this far, I want to challenge you to a dare. I challenge you to do a couple of things. I challenge you to create a bucket list, a list of things that you want to do before you pass away. And the second thing that I want to challenge you to do is to do something on that bucket list this month. I would also love for you to share what's on your bucket list with me. You can join the conversation over at Futurist Frequency on Instagram. I'm very curious to hear what are on people's bucket lists. Is it skydiving? Is it hiking Everest base camp? Is it falling in love? What kind of actionable steps can you do to make that vision a reality? Especially because we all know tomorrow isn't promised. Another thing that I want you to do is to call someone you love and tell them that you love them spontaneously. If you do this, you will notice how good you feel. Telling people how you feel and how much you appreciate them touches on a concept known in mindfulness as loving kindness, where if we focus on the good gets better and we just feel so good. There's something about giving that lights my spirit up. That kind of compassion, that is one of the most beautiful things about being human. So embrace it, baby. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you in my next podcast episode next week. Bye bye.